startup founders, aspiring entrepreneurs, and general business junkies. My name is Ian Scott Cohen. I am your host today of the Founder Underground podcast. And today I'm really stoked to sit down with Jamaila Holder, a dear friend and founder, lead advisor at Holder Advisory and Associates. Jamaila has over 10 years of experience in tech as a product lead and chief of staff at companies like SAP and LinkedIn. And she brings a wealth of knowledge in both product strategy and management. She is very passionate about empowering founders. I've seen it firsthand working side by side with her before to scale effectively through strategic product consulting and teaching the fundamentals of product management. So in this episode, we're going to cover three big overarching points. One is how to make strategic product decisions that drive growth, especially early on. You know, a lot of our listeners are early stage or just got their product together. We're going to talk about best practices for communicating effectively with engineers, especially because a lot of us who are non-technical founders have to work with overseas dev teams or other contractors. And then we'll get into the emerging role of AI in product development and how to think about that. So get ready for a really insightful conversation packed with a ton of stuff. But I really want to start with just a couple of sort of setting the scene questions. I always, I'm not a corporate guy. I haven't been in big tech companies. So I always like to ask, what your experience was like. So real quick, Jamaila, I'd love to start by saying, one, good morning. And two, what was LinkedIn like? What was that like?
Yeah. LinkedIn was a lot of fun. I think that the product itself of LinkedIn of really economic mobility, connecting people to jobs, getting people upskilled so that they can get new careers or transition into new jobs. A lot of that permeated into the teams that you work in, the managers that you have, because you really feel like you are solving problems that matter to people so that they're able to accomplish a number of not only career goals, but possibly even family goals and financial goals by getting these new jobs. And so my experience at LinkedIn was a great one in that we're building a lot of products, and I got a chance to work on a couple of different teams that were really supporting people to get new jobs, supporting people to upskill themselves. And so that was the fun part about working at LinkedIn, is that the mission is really strong. And a lot of that mission permeates onto the teams and then into the product and then across the product development process.
Yeah, I love that. That's refreshing to hear. And I also feel like, as different networks have kind of grown and faded here and there, and we see Facebook kind of fading into the background, not quickly enough for my taste. But, LinkedIn obviously has had a tremendous staying power because it's professional, oriented, right? Our careers kind of don't stop and are always important. So with that, let's shift to what the work you do now. So you do a lot of work with founders and startups around product development, product management. So tell us, what stage of founders do you typically work with? And when you start with a founder, where do you start? What's those first kind of questions you ask?
Yeah, so I have been doing product consulting for about the last year, a little over a year now.
Nice.
And so I'll be honest with you, 2024 was my first full year, and a lot of it was me even figuring out where I should be focusing.
Yeah,
right?
Congrats on the anniversary.
Thank you. It was a lot of fun being in, this zone of solopreneurship for the last year, but I learned a lot.
Yeah.
All right. And so I'd say a lot for me was now that I'm monetizing all of these skills that I've acquired over the last 2 decades of working, I started to realize closer towards the end of the year that my sweet spot for the learning frameworks and the learning techniques around product management can be as early as ideation all the way to Series A, Series B, or I'll say rather until the founder hires their first product person.
Okay.
Yeah, because a lot of what I'm doing with the product management learning and fundamentals and the trainings are for founders so that they have better understanding of the frameworks and techniques that they can use to make their development process easier, especially if they've never built a product before. Versus when I'm looking at the more consulting aspect of things, especially if I'm hands-on with the engineering team, I typically work with founders that have more than just an idea. They have an MVP. They're funded typically, so pre-seed to Series A. And so with that sort of focus with the consulting, a couple of things happen, right? I'm not in the I don't know, minutia, let's say, of doing the discovery on behalf of the founder in that ideation sort of stage, where
Yeah,
I really feel like founders should be super engaged in not only what the idea is, but uncovering the problem and doing a lot of like upfront research
yeah, yeah.
by focusing a lot more to mainly seed and Series A, but sometimes a little bit of pre-seed as well. I
Sure.
am able to work with founders that have talked to a lot of users and are now ready to really figure out what it is that they should be building and how to get that built.
Got it.
And so those two service offerings are a bit distinct in terms of
Yeah.
the ideal customers for both of them and then the ideal outcome as well.
Yeah, yeah. No, that's awesome. I appreciate you sharing that. And if people haven't gotten a sense for it already, you could work with any like tech venture at any point in time because of your product experience. And because when we think about tech ventures, especially, the product is really everything. It's where everything begins and ends. And so the way to think about products and product development is not something that you just need in the beginning, right? It's something that carries through the entire way if you're successful. Ideally, you are. So with that in mind, what's a framework or a process you use to help founders kind of make high impact product decisions, especially early on when they've got a lot of competing priorities? Maybe a customer wants this, the co-founder wants this, the investor thinks that this is important. How do you help people kind of work through that?
Yeah, so what I love is that using some of these frameworks, the first place that you have to start is like, okay, every single piece of a feature or a thing that you think should be built, like, let's just get it all on one list. And what I love to do with founders is really have them rank based on whatever their criteria is.
Sure.
And everyone
Yeah.
has a different understanding as to where they should and how they should be ranking
Yep.
these features for prioritization. And then we start to have a conversation around, are they using a framework in their head? Are they applying something specific? How are they coming up
Yeah.
with
Or are they just
their
going with
own?
what they feel like is cool and
Yeah,
aligned with their vision? Yeah.
and sometimes it's that product gut, right?
Yeah.
We all have a product gut of some sort, right?
Yeah.
And
Sure.
so I like to know where the founder is thinking their product gut is or where it's leading them and how and why. And so
Yeah.
that's how I initially start. But then when I start to ask more pointed questions around what's on the list, that's when you start to uncover the rationale and the reasoning
Yeah.
as to, why they are prioritizing something in like the top 5 or the top 10
Right.
that maybe to me seems like it wouldn't be as important, but it's important to them and I'd want to know why.
Yeah, yeah, I love that. And I'm sure having been in that seat myself, it's probably an extremely anxiety inducing experience for founders at first, right? Because you kind of have to dissect all of your decisions too.
Yeah.
And once you sit with someone who's done product like yourself, it quickly becomes clear. It's like, okay, some of these features maybe weren't necessary at this point in time. I'm curious if there's any specific question or that always kind of stirs the pot, it gets things really open so you can start having real conversation, or if it's more of just the process in general forces people to be more self-aware about it.
Yeah, so I want to know what they're optimizing for. And a lot of times what the list will show is that they're not necessarily optimizing for anything.
Yeah, yeah. Can you
Right?
tell us what that means in your
Yeah.
head? What does that mean to
So when
optimize
I say
something?
what you're optimizing for, like what's most important to you, right? When you look at this list and if an investor, let's say, were to say, okay, so what are the next things that you think should be on your product roadmap? Let's say
Yeah,
you
yeah.
are in those active investor conversations where
Right.
you want to show to that investor that like, hey, I've thought through what this product should look like, and here are the next things that we need to do in order to get this product to the next level, and that's why I need your money, right?
Yeah,
You
right,
have to
right.
think about, okay, so what am I optimizing for at this point in time? What is
Yeah.
most important to me that aligns with what's most important to me, whether it's growth or, customer satisfaction,
Yeah,
or
or
something of that
retention or
nature.
churn. Yeah,
Exactly.
yeah,
Like whatever that thing is, that's the features that you should actually be building for. But sometimes there's a multitude of things, right? And
yeah,
that's okay too. ultimately what you want to be able to do is justify the decisions that you have on your feature priority list, especially when they're in like the top 10. And
Right.
so one of the ways in which I help people do that is I'll look at two different variables. Sometimes, people are optimizing for cost, right? They're like, okay, I don't have a whole ton of money and I have these engineers possibly overseas,
Yeah,
right,
yeah.
that I'm paying. I need to get something done quickly and I don't necessarily know what it is. If people are optimizing for cost, which they usually are, that can't be the
Yep.
only thing that's important because the cost of your engineers doesn't necessarily translate into your customers wanting to use your product. And
Right.
so then I start asking more questions around like where are you with the product and your customers? And so of all the things that are on this list, if you were to take five of them off, what would those things be that your customers wouldn't miss? And then
Yeah.
you start to kind of get into that cycle of, okay, so what are the things that you think your customers absolutely need at this point in time because you've done some research, you know that this is what they're expecting of your
Yep.
product versus what are some of those other things that really seem like they're nice to have, but that's
Hmm.
not what's going to drive the people to not only use your product once, but then hopefully use it again and again and again. So what are those
Yeah.
features?
Yeah,
So
yeah.
you start to map out, not just the cost of everything, but also the
Right.
cost driven by investing in the development of features that you know your customers are absolutely going to need.
Yep.
Then you can start to make a bit more of like an educated decision as to what you should be prioritizing and why.
Yeah.
And I think ultimately what's helpful for founders is when they are able to get two or three elements that they are most that they prioritize highly and make sure that the features actually drive to those things. And that's when a lot of stuff that really just isn't as important starts
Yeah.
to fall off the list. And that's
Yeah,
how you
yeah.
start to like whittle the list down to like a top 10 versus, everything's
Yeah.
important.
Right, right. Yeah. No, it's there's so much I want to unpack there because honestly, so many, my whole hypothesis is that a lot of times founders are their biggest obstacle, especially in the beginning, especially if you're building a product in a field you're not necessarily familiar with as much. Being a non-technical founder myself, there's a lot of learning that I did, which cost me a lot of money. And so I love that, it really comes back to that customer. It's like, what feature will drive value for the customer and keep them coming back to you or getting them in the door in the first place most of the time. And so I want to ask you, two questions, and they're sort of double-sided coin here. One is, what are some common pitfalls you see amongst founders when they're developing a product early on? And then you talked about, okay, how are they basing their feature development decisions, right? Like, what are they looking at? What data do they have? So I'm curious what types of data points you value in that process. Is it like testimonials? Is it surveys? Is it actual usage data? And which ones do you find more compelling than others, if any, or if it's just all context dependent?
Yeah, so in terms of the data question, I'd say it depends on the stage of the actual
Yeah, sure, sure.
development, right? So if you're in that early stage ideation, trying to figure out what to build, then I am overemphasizing on that founder having talked to their user base and
Yeah,
having good conversations with that user base to really drive and understand like what is the real problem that they're trying to solve. If
right.
the product is, past MVP and it's already launched to the market, then I'm really looking at the usage data. Sometimes, unfortunately, founders don't necessarily set up those data pipelines
Right.
to be
Yeah,
able
it's
to
hard.
look at the usage data because it takes time. Like
And
it's
it can be
not
really
just
expensive. I mean,
you.
we
Yep.
for our product, we bought a system that we plugged in, and it took us a long time to figure it out. And then, the worst case scenario, we spent that money. We pull up the data like a month into our usage cycle, I'll say, and there wasn't a lot there because a lot of people weren't using it. So, you know, that's like the most terrifying thing I think scares a lot of early stage founders away from data is like it kind of the risk is that it shatters sort of reality that you're building. It's like, oh, my product's out there, I got customers, but if the customers aren't using your product, they're not going to come back, right? And so, I'm curious if, going back to that second part of the question, pitfalls that you've seen, and if you can get into specifics, like I'm sure it's mostly like people building stuff nobody wanted or asked for, right? But what does that look like in practice, and how do you help people kind of come to that conclusion?
Yeah. Well, I think there are two things. Sometimes, yes, it's we built it. We even have customers, they're just not using it. They are now paying us and they're not really like
happens all the time.
Repeating customers, right? Like they said, yes, this sounds great. Or especially if it's some sort of like B2B product, right? Like the person that you sold the product to was like, yes, this is going to help our employees. This is going to help our team.
Right.
But the adoption isn't there. Right. Yep. And so that's a harder thing to maneuver around, because that requires you then going back to the customer, alerting them that they're not using it. Which,
and do you want to rock the boat?
Right. You don't want to rock the boat in some ways, because you're like, well, if they realize that they're not using it, they just might cancel.
Right.
One of the ways I think that you can start to circumvent that is, one, when you put that data pipeline in place, you really ought to be, especially at this earlier stage, checking it every day, right? So you are in there every day and you're able to see like nuanced changes. That's also how you might identify if there's something in the product that isn't working.
Yeah.
Because unless your customer tells you that there's a bug, or you're actively tinkering with the product every single day, you're not going to know. So if you had a bunch of customers using it one day and all of a sudden there's this like huge drop off and you're like, wait, what happened? Something might actually be broken. You just don't know.
Sure.
Right? So that's why I always say, like, when you get that data pipeline set up, like, check it literally every day. It may seem like one of those like mundane actions that you take, but it's those mundane actions that help you to understand where your product is actually landing with your user. The second thing I'd say in terms of the customer itself and whether or not they are or aren't using the product is the communication that you should be having with that customer. You don't want to overload them and bombard them, right? Like,
right. It's a delicate balance.
To the point where they're just like, oh my gosh, I hear from you every day. No, you don't want that. Right. But what you do want are check-ins, reasonable check-ins, especially if it's B2B, right? If it's B2C, it's a little different.
Sure.
Because, the relationship is one-to-one when it's B2C. So,
right.
Depending on, how many customers you have, like, it's harder to do that with B2C. So with that, what I say is, with the B2C aspect of things, it's not just set it and forget it. It's kind of like set it, see how they're using it, send some test emails out, kind of, trying to engage them one way or another. To get them engaged, to use the product, to get them engaged, to get some feedback as well.
Right.
So I'm a fan of surveys, like you had mentioned, surveys, that sort of thing. I'm a fan of those after a little bit of time, especially tracking specific users and trying to figure out how they're using your product.
Right.
I am also a fan of doing some user research calls after they've used the product, to get them on the phone and hear, all right, so you've used some of this stuff already. What do you think? Where are you? Right?
Yep.
Where does it meet in terms of like your value schema? Are you feeling like it's high value and it's providing you with enough and solving the problem that you have? Or do you feel like there's still like quite a bit to go, but we're on the right path?
Right.
Ultimately, what you want are check-ins along the way. It shouldn't be, I've launched the product, it's out in the universe, and now everyone's going to go and use it. Because it's hard to get people to download an app if your class is in an app. It's hard to get people to go to your website and do whatever they're supposed to do every day.
Right.
And so you do need that additional effort and thought around, it's not just me launching the product, but it's also like me like managing those relationships after the user has started using the product.
Yeah. All that's gold advice. I mean, it's one of those things where, especially early, and I would argue early is probably a much bigger length of time than people think when we're talking about tech products, especially like, a lot of Series B, Series C companies still consider themselves startups because they're still kind of figuring out how to be a robust business, right? And so that's the point I want to drive home here, is that your initial customers, you don't build a business around a customer, you build it around your product or your service. And early on, those customers have to give you feedback. Like, that's the most important thing. Even if they don't renew, feedback is more important in the beginning than, assuming, we're not talking about like 7-figure customers here. But it's one of those things where I've seen it too many times. I've done it myself. You're a founder, your vision comes to life finally, it's out there, and so you're terrified to look at data because of what it might say, and you feel like, well, I know it's not going to say anything great yet because we need to add more features, and to add more features I need to go out and raise money, or I need to go out and do these other things that aren't related to looking at and making my product better, right? And that is almost always backwards. It's about how can we get the product to a place that the customer loves it, because that'll make everything else possible. Not easier, possible. If you have a product that nobody's using, which a lot of people do, I mean, it's just a fact. There was a crazy stat I saw a couple of years ago. It was like 60% or 65% of all I'll use the ed tech space, of all ed tech SaaS licenses go unused every year. Yeah, and I think that's true across most industries, right? And so it's it's actually the norm, right? It's crazy, and I think founders have to just kind of build that resilience to say, you know what, I'm going to look at it every day. I'm going to make it part of my routine. I'm just going to get used to it, because once I get used to it, then I realize this is just a gold mine of information, hopefully, and that's where improvement comes from and success comes from, right? So I love that. I want to make sure we get to a couple other questions here. The next one I had on my list was around collaborating with engineers. So I know this is something that you help founders with, especially non-technical ones. But you even alluded to this before. There's a lot of overseas development now too. Like if you want an MVP, a lot of ecosystems in the US kind of, rightfully so, push us to go offshore and find a dev team. They can be extremely great, and their prices tend to be favorable compared to domestic. But collaborating with engineers, no matter where they are, is a process unto itself. So I'd love to hear, if there's a common misstep some non-technical founders might make with engineers, and how they can avoid that when they're communicating.
Yeah, I think there are 3 common missteps that are made. One, I've talked to enough founders now that are like, hey, I talked to my engineer. I thought I was clear about what I needed from them. And
Sure.
Then I didn't get what I thought I was going to get. Like, why didn't it turn out the way that, I assumed it would?
Yep.
Sometimes, one conversation is not enough, right? You need actual multiple conversations with your engineering team. I think sometimes people don't realize that, like, in product management, we literally write everything down in our requirements.
Yeah.
And so
what's an example of like something so minuscule that a lot of us just forget about?
So let's say you are building an app, and you're doing app development with your engineering team. And the app development says, like, okay, I want this person to register. Let's say you're just going through the onboarding process, so you're not even in the midst of what the app actually does.
Sure.
I want this person to register on the app. It'd be nice if they, had a picture, name, email, and, why they believe they should be using this product or something of that nature. Like, literally everything that I just mentioned needs to be spelt out for the engineers.
Yeah.
Do you want that picture in a circular motion? Do you want it in a rectangular motion?
Yeah. Should name be first name, last name, or just name? Do they have to put in their actual name?
That's what I was going to say. Like, is the name like the first name and, the initial of the last name? Do you want the full name? So everything has to be spelled out. And I think that's the misconception. It's like, hey, I have these engineers on the phone. They're smart people. They can just build for me. And I told them that I need a name and I need an email address. It's like, okay, well, are you saying that you want the full name or you want the first name?
Right. And it sounds silly, right? But it's silly, important.
Right? You're like, no, I mean, come on now. Like,
just do what you do. Just like, shouldn't they know to do this? Yeah, they should just know to do this. Yeah.
Someone would be like, it doesn't matter. I don't care. Why don't you
Yeah.
figure it out? But the moment you relinquish that control to your engineer, means that that's the moment where you start letting your engineer build and make decisions on your behalf. And
Hmm.
that's when you actually start to diverge in terms of what you thought you were going to get and what you actually got.
Yeah.
So, what I'd
Right.
say is, one of those main missteps is that you think you're clear as a founder because you've said it on a phone call,
Right.
but it's not translatable to that engineer who,
Yeah.
is maybe 12 hours, 14 hours ahead of you in a time zone
Yeah.
listening to this one call and
Yep.
doesn't have everything spelt out. And so that starts the cycle of, you being during your day, you're working on other things. And then when you're sleeping, they're awake and they're wondering, like, okay, so I don't have all the details that I need. So now they're sending you
Yeah.
an email in the middle of the night. Then you wake
Right.
up to an email on the morning, but by the time you're waking up, they're probably winding
Yeah,
down.
and they probably sent it middle of their day, so they lost the second half of those hours too. And now
Exactly.
you're like, wow, my whole timeline shifted because I didn't realize that I need to tell them that people need to be able to delete this thing that they just made or whatever it is. I've had that happen personally, so
Yep.
I get that. Okay, so that's misstep number one is not being crystal clear about requirements, like what
Right.
all the little things. What were the other two? You said there were three.
Yeah, so I think all the little things are actually not little at all. Very important, very
Yeah,
important
yeah,
big thing.
right.
I'd say the other thing that I found as well in terms of missteps is that you think that you talk to a couple users and you think that you kind of have an idea as to like what problem you're actually solving,
Hmm.
but you talk to them for about 10 or 15 minutes and you ask them guiding questions like, hey,
Yeah,
you have this problem?
right,
And it's
right,
like,
right.
okay, well, if you ask me a guiding question, I can give you a guided answer.
Yeah,
But,
right. Would you want to use this thing if it did all these amazing things for you?
right.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I
And
mean, this is
so
discovery, right? This is
that's the
customer discovery
discovery.
is just the same principles. You can't ask leading, hypothetical questions like that.
Right. So it's sometimes it's the guiding questions that get us to start thinking that we need to build something one way.
Yeah,
When if you really peeked under the hood and asked your questions and structured your questions differently, you may actually get a different outcome. You may find that the problem you're thinking of
yeah,
isn't the one that's most important to them. There's that problem, but there's a larger issue that you might be able to solve and make easier for them
yeah,
instead.
yep,
So sometimes it's the guiding questions during discovery that leads people astray and gets them to start building stuff that they don't actually
yeah,
need, but they just don't know it in time.
yeah. That's a big one.
The other thing that I've also found with founders is that they have a like, if I build it, they will come sort of
Yeah,
mentality where they're like,
naturally.
okay,
Yeah,
so I know that there are 5 other competitors in this same space that are already like working on this, but here's how my thing is different. But
right.
as you're building that product, what I would always say is that as you're building that plane, you should also be trying to do some light promotion and marketing during
Mm-hmm.
that time and
Yeah,
getting, your list of potential users and customers together so that when the product is finally ready for development, you can start to test it out and put people in beta programs and have
yeah,
them give you some really great feedback right away. Because a lot of times people will build the product and then they try and find the customers. And it's like,
right.
oh, while you were building, that's actually the time to engage customers because
Yeah,
instead of building it, spending the dev hours and the dev money on the things, you can actually start to build with users if they're open to it. Not everybody's going to have time for it, but there are
sure.
usually at least a couple people that would be open to helping you start to build this in terms of the decisions that you have to make
Yep.
so that you know that you're building on the right track and that you're not wasting, resources and time.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'd also add to that one of the things I think we underestimate. So, one, there's like a famous tweet I saw once that I've heard people say it's like first time founders focus on product, second time founders focus on sales and distribution. And because, there's been a ton of amazing products out there that just never make it because they didn't have the sales and marketing support or figured out. And I'll just chalk up all my failures as that. But the other thing I was going to say along those lines, though, was that you have to. If there's a competitor out there, which almost there always is, and there likely should be, if
Yeah.
it's a problem worth solving, we also underestimate it's not, is your product better? Is your product worth switching to? Right? Is it worth the headache? If you're B2B, if you're selling to businesses, is it worth the headache of getting my team to, well, first of all, getting people to look at this new thing and to get interested in it, sign off on it, pay for it, then switch to it. In education technology, that's one of, if not the biggest thing, is getting teachers to change behavior. And so that's why your product has to be so much better in the most compelling way, the one that's most valuable. And I think a lot of times we think that breadth of features instead of depth of feature is the way to go. It's like, oh, well, we'll have this, and this, and this. And it's like, okay, but each of those is like its own thing, right? The engineer's got to go out and build out the whole thing and how it does interact with all the other stuff. And it's like, yeah. Even now, right? Like, I think Gen AI is one of those things where a lot of these big tech companies are putting it into their stuff, but it's not really, like, people aren't really using it that much outside of ChatGPT or those kind of interfaces. Literally this morning, as I'm getting ready for this interview, I'm, typing up some notes and everything, and Google Docs, like Gemini AI pops out of the side and it's like, hey, Gemini's here. Can we help you? And I'm like, no, get out of my way. Like, I know what I'm doing already with this product because I don't know the compelling use case. It's like, why do I need you right now? I don't. And I think you just have to be more, I don't want to say cynical, but like realistic about what an average person's day-to-day feelings and thoughts are like, right? Which is why that discovery is so critical. So I know we only have like a couple minutes here, so I want to sneak in one more question before I get us out of here. And it's around AI. Good segue. So AI and product development, I think a lot of us, see what Gen AI can do today and are like, wow, I could use it for this, this, and this. I want to put it in my product. So what's one practical way you think founders can actually leverage AI in their product strategy, even if they're just starting out an understanding of it? Or should they rush headlong in and plug in Gen AI wherever they can figure it out?
No, I think it's a good question. I think that, one, I want to make a distinction because sometimes founders are like, I'm an AI company. And then I'm like, okay, well, what part of the problem that you're solving are you solving with AI? And it's like the most minuscule part, right?
Sure.
And so AI, saying you're an AI company, but not having like the main product be AI.
Yeah.
In my
opinion, knowing what that means, right?
And knowing what that means and being able to explain it in that way, that to me means that it's not an AI product. And it doesn't mean that it has to be. It could just be that there's one part of your product that, is AI enabled, and that's okay too.
Yeah.
Right? So depending on what you're working on, first I'd say really define whether or not you think that AI is actually going to be part of your product. There are different ways to make AI part of your like product development process though, right? So your product doesn't have to be an AI product in order to start to infuse AI tools into your actual product development. One of those things I might say is that, hey, the requirements that I'm talking about, the requirements I'm saying you have to write, like start to figure out how you might be able to use ChatGPT or, Gemini or Perplexity, not only for the research that you want to do around like what you're building, but for how to explain in your requirements what you should be writing and sending to your engineers. So that's one way that I've been, helping people to understand and teaching them really how to use AI during development. Writing requirements to me is a lot of fun, but I'm a product manager. Like I like thinking through like, okay, so if the person lands on this page and I want them to take this next action, how do I get them there? I love the details of all of that because I'm responsible for making sure that I take my user from that very beginning part of the user flow all the way to the end where they are now doing whatever the actions are that I need them to do.
Right.
Everyone's not like me. I get it. So
but you grow to appreciate a product Once you start building it, you realize like, oh, okay, these little decisions, it's like a mouse in a maze, right? Ideally, your product isn't a maze, but a lot of products start out that way. And it's just the user is the mouse taking all these different turns. And so it's like, where can I put up a wall or an incentive or a color or whatever it is, a new door, to finish my metaphor, that would lead the mouse to the cheese, so to speak.
So, that's honestly it. So sometimes in the requirements writing process, because it is so detailed and so granular, you might be able to use AI to help you refine those requirements, or at least give you a starting point before you start to kind of edit out and revise what AI has given you. I would never say take your AI requirements and then give them to your engineers.
Sure.
That's probably not the best way to do
at least read them and double check
Read them, understand them, think through them logically. Like, okay, if I have them go from here to here to here, what else do I think might be needed? Right? But it's a good starting point, at least for writing requirements, since it is such a detailed part of being a founder and a product leader and a product owner. And it can help you to save some time.
Yeah, no, I love that. And we could talk so much more, and I would like to, about all of this stuff, because we didn't even get into scaling. We also could talk about, writing requirements. A lot of times engineers don't have context about who your user is and what, they don't know what teachers do or what, whoever you're serving. And so there's a lot we could unpack there. Unfortunately, today I need to cut us short, but thank you everybody for tuning in. Thank you, Jamaila, for being a part of this and the Founder Underground podcast. I hope you enjoyed this insightful conversation with Jamaila, where we unpacked the secrets to making strategic product decisions, especially early on, communicating with engineers, and leveraging AI in product development without necessarily calling yourself an AI product, because those are different things. If you found this episode valuable, don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a review. It helps us continue bringing in on more guests and having more impactful conversations like Jamaila. To learn more about Jamaila's work or to get her involved in your product development, check out Holder Advisory and Associates, which I will include the link and all the information in the show notes, or connect with her on LinkedIn. I'll also put that link in there. So stay tuned for more episodes. And as always, keep building and growing and making an impact. Thank you, Jamaila, so much for being on.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
All right.